You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we are coming off of this insane Supreme Court ruling that has basically imbued a potential President Donald Trump with unlimited powers. So as we now, settle into this July 4th holiday, I know that people are looking for actionable solutions here. I know that they're looking for some sense that we have some agency in this and that there needs to be a reason not to despair. Can you go over maybe what you think as we look at the Supreme Court ruling, what you think might be most helpful in terms of taking an actionable solution?
There are a few solutions that I think we have available, and I'm going to look to you to discuss the political ones. I'm going to try to talk about the legal ones, but one that I think we are both in agreement on, Brian, is that we are now the jury. We, the American people, are the last jury, and I say the last jury because it doesn't look like any of Donald Trump's other criminal prosecutions, which, will have a jury sitting in judgment of his crimes, just as, when that happened in New York, they convicted him in a New York minute based on the evidence. There is no other jury standing between Donald Trump and dictatorship before the election. But we, the people, are now the jury in a very real sense. What do jurors do? They listen to evidence, they make a decision, and they vote. In a criminal case, they vote guilty or not guilty. In an election setting, we, the people, the jurors, will go to the polls based on the evidence we've seen, the information we've obtained. We will vote, and we will vote Donald Trump guilty by making sure he never retakes the reins of governmental power as president of the United States. So that is the first, the last, and everything in between when it comes to solutions and what we must do. The other thing that can be done and should be done, and I think it's incumbent upon us to make our voices heard on this precise topic, we have to expand the Supreme Court. Not for political reasons. Listen, we all know that the Supreme Court has been packed, nefariously so, by Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell. They've crammed unqualified, hard-right judges down America's throat. We need to expand the Supreme Court, right? Just to sort of level the playing field as kind of balanced against the unqualified right-wing ideological hacks who have now captured the Supreme Court and just issued a ruling that is contrary to the Constitution in their zeal to give Donald Trump a walk for the many crimes he committed against the American people. Now, we know that the Biden administration thus far has not had an appetite to expand the number of Supreme Court justices. But think about this, Brian. In recent years, we have expanded the federal courts generally. Why? Because as our population grows, and as the caseloads of federal judges grow, and as the federal jurisdictions themselves expand and multiply, we're now up to 13. It only makes sense to not only increase the number of federal court judges and appellate court judges nationwide, but to similarly increase the number of Supreme Court justices. We have now expanded to 13 federal judicial districts. And the norm is, and has been, one justice on the Supreme Court has some supervisory responsibility over each of the federal jurisdictions around the country. But because we don't have enough Supreme Court justices, some justices have to double up and take supervisory responsibility over 2 federal jurisdictions, which frankly is a recipe for disaster. So that is just a basic reason, an inarguable reason to norm for the population, norm for the expanded caseloads, norm for the sort of ever multiplying federal jurisdictions, and raise the number. I propose 13. There's some parity there. 13 federal jurisdictions, 13 Supreme Court justices. And here's the thing, Brian. We have heard that in this, 2025 plan, the march toward totalitarianism that the Republicans have published as their, guidebook for how they're going to destroy America in the event Donald Trump gets reelected. They said they're going to raise the number of justices.
Right.
So why in the hell would we lay back and wait for them to put more Thomases and more Alitos and more Gorsuches and more Kavanaughs and more Amy Coney Barretts on the bench when we can actually put fully qualified, not left-wing hacks, not right-wing hacks, fully qualified judges who can serve honorably, honestly, and ethically as Supreme Court justices.
And I would just add, for anybody out there who says maybe is taking a more judicious approach and say, okay, well, if we do this, that'll just invite abuse by the right. It'll invite retaliation by the right. They are abusing the system right now. We're looking at a Supreme Court, a 6-3 conservative court right now, that is disregarding the plain text of the Constitution in blind deference to Donald Trump, whether it's in terms of creating out of whole cloth these provisions that would give him presidential immunity, or ignoring Section 3 of the 14th Amendment that says that he would be disqualified based on his inciting an insurrection on January 6th. The idea that we don't want to take action right now because we don't want to invite abuse in the future by the right ignores the fact that that abuse is already happening. We're already in the worst case scenario in terms of the Supreme Court. So we can either wait for it to get worse, because to your exact point, it will get worse if we don't do anything and just leave them full clear runway to add justices themselves and further entrench right-wing rule, or we can take steps right now to aggressively push back and either fix our democracy or let it languish, let it fall to the people who are perfectly content, who are broadcasting their willingness to break it.
And Brian, as a final thought on that topic, people need to know that 9 is not a magic number. We have 9 Supreme Court justices in our nation's history. We've had as few as 5. We've had as many as 10. 9 is not a magic number, and don't let anybody fool you into believing there is some principled or historical reason why we can't increase the number of Supreme Court justices. But what about on the political front? I mean, what can folks get out there and do to combat this on the political front?
Yep, that's a great question. Real quick, just on the number 9. By the way, it was 8 just as recently as a few years ago when Republicans held off on Merrick Garland's seat because they were waiting to be able to install their own Supreme Court justice. So this is an ancient history here in terms of the number of Supreme Court justices that were changed to help a political party. On the political front, though, I think what we need to do right now is make this issue front and center. We have, again, a Supreme Court that is disregarding the plain text of the Constitution. We should be holding hearings. At least in the Senate, we have the majority. Why Dick Durbin, as chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, isn't holding hearings when Republicans just finished a 16-month tour of investigations into the purported criminality of Joe Biden, for which there existed zero evidence whatsoever, not a modicum of evidence. And yet we sat there for months and months and months and listened to 1023 forms that were based on nothing, where the person who submitted them was actually a Russian agent who got indicted by the FBI. We have car loans that were repaid from Joe to Hunter. I mean, nothing. And yet we sat there and allowed them to drive the narrative based on this completely baseless investigation. And yet now, when we have legitimate criminality, legitimate corruption, the idea that we're not holding a single hearing is an absolute miscarriage of justice. So look, I think that everybody watching right now should pick up the phone and call Dick Durbin's office in his capacity as chair of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. That number is 202-224-7703. Again, 202-224-7703, and demand hearings into this issue. Again, this is the Supreme Court ushering the United States into this totalitarian fever dream that Republicans are pushing forward with their Project 2025 agenda. The notion that we are going to just let them get away with it because, we might not be able to actually impeach any Supreme Court justice. Does that mean we just let democracy die in darkness because the end of the line might not be possible right now? The point is to shine sunlight on this stuff and to let people know what the corruption is, because I can guarantee you 100% that they will only be emboldened if we refuse to take any action whatsoever.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I will be calling Dick Durbin's office. I frequently do call or contact my elected representatives to make my voice heard, and I think everybody should do it. Even, if you're in a state where you're like, well, I'm in a red state, they're not going to listen, it doesn't matter. Do it anyway, because ultimately you're going to be creating a record and you're going to make yourself feel better because you are participating. You're taking action, not just sitting back and being a victim.
And one last thing, by the way, just on that point, they do log those calls. So if there are 0 calls, there is no pressure on the Dick Durbins of the world to do what's right. But if there are 100, 500, 1,000 calls all of a sudden to do something, let's not kid ourselves into thinking that it's going to be easy to disregard all of those voices that are hammering away at his office. Just on a broader point, Glenn, and I want to let you finish off with this. What's your message to people who may look at all of this corruption, all of this criminality, and feel completely helpless, completely despairing that, now we have the highest court in the land, and potentially, if Donald Trump, God forbid, if he wins the presidency in 2025, we then have the executive branch, both of whom are perfectly willing to disregard the law, the Constitution in blind deference to their own pursuit of power. What do you say to people who feel helpless right now and whose gut reaction may be to just throw their hands up, walk away, and just say, forget it?
I feel anxious. Sometimes I get depressed, and I feel like, there's not really much I can do. And what I do, Brian, is I let those feelings sort of motivate me. I try to convert them into action and determination and call and write and give to a candidate of my choice, even if it's only $5. But I get involved in phone banking, help register people to vote, help, prepare to get people to the polls. Maybe you've never helped your neighbors get to the polls. Do it this time. Action helps. When you're out there and you're moving and you're doing and you're participating, it not only helps the process, but I think it helps us each individually. And so I would say, let your anxiety, your desperation, even your depression sort of motivate you. Because here's the thing, Brian. The radical right-wing bloc, whether on the Supreme Court or in Congress or, Trump's ugly, dirty little camp of lapdogs and flunkies and sycophants, they want us desperate and despondent and depressed, and they want us throwing up our hands, and they don't want us engaged. Get engaged, because that's the best revenge.
Right. Do not reward the people seeking to strip your rights away with exactly what they want. That would be the polar opposite of what we should be doing here. So again, let your anger or your despair fuel you into doing something that those people don't want. With that said, we will, of course, stay on top of this. We'll beat these drums as much as we can, and we'll stay in this fight. But I think the only way we win this is if we all make sure that we're fighting this battle together. With that said, for those watching right now, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.